Well, Jim Gardner, you've been here as curator for quite a long time. What does Wisley mean to you?
Well, Wisley is the epitome of horticultural excellence, but it covers such a wide range, as wide a range as you'll find in any garden anywhere in the world. Nowhere can you find such an excellent collection of fruit and vegetables alongside woody plants and herbaceous plants to the level of display that we actually show here.
Of course, there have been thousands of changes and developments over the last century, but you arrived when the 1987 hurricane had just wiped out most of your trees?
Well, this area around us, Nigel, Battleston Hill, lost 80% of its top cover, quite literally overnight. And so it's a huge rebuilding exercise for the staff. Not only the plant material and the infrastructure, but rebuilding the staff morale as well. And so it's been a huge job to get things back online. But it's been an extremely satisfying one.
And it presents you with more opportunities to change things, doesn't it?
Very much so. There's these huge opportunities that have presented itself to display new ideas in horticulture.
On this particular Sunday morning, I took the bin down, and just as I was disappearing behind the trees, I heard a voice, "I say, my man!" And of course I immediately took no notice. "I say, my man!" Still no notice. "I say!" And I said, "Oh, I'm sorry, were you talking to me?" And this lady said, "Yes, I was." She says, "Where do we go in?" So I said, "You go in by the main gate. When the gates open," I said, "What's the time now?" "It's 10 o'clock. I said, "Well, the gates open in about 4 hours' time." And, "Oh, we've come from the Midlands." I said, "Well, I'm terribly sorry if you're fellows of the society. If you look at your ticket, it will tell you that on Sundays the gates open 2 p.m, fellows only." And I was glad that I kept my nerve.
How on earth can you describe a world-class garden in 55 minutes? 240 acres, that's 100 hectares, over 100 years. A century of plant collecting, 100 years of changing fashions, 100 years of developing science and knowledge and learning how to cope with changing times. But above all, this wonderful garden is a place of displays. They have special events here, there are special plantings all over the place, but if you just want to enjoy the peace and quiet, there is that too. You can just wander wherever you like in total tranquility. It's fantastic. Now, I have to admit to a vested interest here because I've been a member of the Royal Horticultural Society for longer than I care to admit, and I've known and loved this garden for more than 30 years. And like all the other Royal Horticultural Society gardens, this one was a most generous gift made 100 years ago. But as you'll see in a minute, a heck of a lot more has happened since then. The story of Wisley starts not in Surrey but in Chiswick, London, well over 100 years ago. The Royal Horticultural Society had a site here for flower shows and an experimental station proving fruit, flowers and vegetables. There was great interest from the members, then known as Fellows. If Kensington was to be the seat of high art, then Chiswick was to be the seat of practical horticulture. But in time, these fashionable gardens began to suffer from the growing city.
Chiswick was gradually being absorbed by London, and the suburbs were spreading, and it was becoming surrounded by housing, and as a result, air pollution began taking its effect. And when the washing of greenhouses became a daily ritual to get the smoke off them, and the plants outdoors were becoming covered with soot and so on, to such an extent that in the early 1890s, the Royal Society funded a study of air pollution to take place at the Chiswick Garden. There was a great need to get a garden away from the air pollution.
In 1878, 2 estates came onto the market in Wisley. They were bought by keen horticulturist and RHS treasurer George Wilson. Attracted by the microclimates here, he intended to develop an experimental garden as no one else had done. By all accounts, Wilson was abrasive and forthright, but there were times when he could be downright whimsical.
In one issue of the Gardener's Chronicle, he published a letter allegedly written by his cat, Fat Tommy, explaining how the cat was put to use keeping the fruit garden free from birds. The cat was tied by a leash to a running wire so that it could not escape from the garden, but could run up and down and chase the birds away reasonably happily.
The garden, with its oak woodland, open heathland and water, inspired Wilson to indulge his passion for experimentation. He filled the woodlands with camellias, rhododendrons and other exotics, and this wonderful garden soon became rightly acclaimed.
Wilson died in 1902 at the age of 80. And as soon as they heard of his death, the RHS Council asked, is his garden going to come up for sale? And a year passed in which nothing significant happened. During that time, some unknown person attempted to buy Wisley and then abandoned it on the ground that it was so difficult to get to from London. And so in the summer of 1903, Sir Thomas Hanbury approached the RHS Council secretly and offered to buy Wisley and present it to the RHS as an experimental garden.
The gift of the garden was perfect for the RHS, as reported in the council meeting minutes. For the first time in 99 years, there was applause. And so, under the watchful eye of the superintendent, a Mr. Wright, a team from Chiswick was sent to begin work on what would become one of the world's most famous gardens.
Almost the first thing that the RHS did at Wisley was to build new glass houses to accommodate some of the exotic fruit collections being moved from Chiswick.
With the start of the First World War, work in the garden slowed dramatically as men were called away to fight. But surprisingly, the war didn't prevent the RHS continuing to spread the horticultural word, even to those behind enemy lines.
First of all, the RHS helped organize collections of seeds for military hospitals, eventually for prisoners of war, and for civilians in internment camps. There was a celebrated internment camp in Berlin called Ruhleben, a former race course, which was meant to house enemy aliens who'd been caught in Germany by the outbreak of war. The internees set up their own horticultural society, contacted the RHS for assistance, and were sent large quantities of seeds, and they began holding their own flower shows and best garden competitions.
That terrible war took its toll on Wisley's staff and students. 1916 saw the completion of the laboratory, and through the 20s and 30s, Wisley continued its role as a centre of horticultural excellence, with the start of national fruit trials in 1922. From 1934, the general public were allowed to enter the garden during weekdays on the payment of 2 shillings and 6pence. During the Second World War, the RHS encouraged us to grow food, providing numerous publications and demonstrations to help. And, as in the First War, seeds were distributed to prisoner of war camps, and internees could still take RHS examinations. At a time when Wisley's telephone number was Ripley 34, the garden staff that remained were helped by the Women's Land Army.
Wisley really was very quiet indeed during the war. Of course, most of the young men had been called up. I came to Wisley first in 1943 as part of a team of girls that were coming for 6 months to work on the vegetable trial grounds, to look after the seeds that were coming in under the lease lend agreement. They had to be tested before they could go into the open market for suitability to conditions here. I think we learned quite a lot about vegetables, and vegetables some of which we hadn't grown before, like Sweet corn, for instance, I hadn't come across before. The bombers that were going out for daylight raids, they go around in great squadrons assembling, and we were quite used to that. But I remember one morning when there was a particular number of squadrons, and they came from all directions, and they used to circle round in their squadrons like birds all over the sky. But because it was a very pink morning, all their trails were coming from the horizon.
After the war, while Britain was still coping with rationing, Wisley showed gardeners how they could produce their own food by creating small-scale vegetable and fruit gardens. Weather recording was one of the first things to move from Chiswick to Wisley. Accurate records are an essential part of any horticultural planning. George Gilbert, a student at Wisley in the late 1940s and later fruit officer, recalls one afternoon on the 21st of July, 1965.
I was running the Wisley Met Station, which has been going for as long as Wisley's been going, I think. And it had been a very thundery day. We had had 3 short thunderstorms, if I remember rightly. And at 4 o'clock, I retreated to the laboratory for a cup of coffee and so on. And in the middle of having this tea, coffee, whatever, several of us were looking out of the window. And we said, good gracious, look at all those birds flying around like this, you see. And somebody suddenly said, that's not birds. And we looked again, and we could see branches of trees and God knows what going around, and this was the tornado, which of course had come literally right across the fruit field from one side to the other. And it was quite unbelievable what it had done. I remember one tree had been twisted off from the stem. The head of the tree had gone, and you looked around and when we looked again, it had gone only a few yards and it landed upside down in an apple tree. The force must have been incredible, quite incredible.
But that was nothing compared to the night in 1987 that would change the future of Wisley forever.
And the main headline this morning, several people are feared dead during a night of violent storms. Towns and cities are facing a major clean-up operation with extensive damage to homes and offices.
During October the 16th, a great storm ripped through the whole of southern England. 80% of the trees on Battleston Hill were torn from the ground, and staff like John Batty were faced with a scene of devastation.
The gardens were not designed for equipment to get around. It was all dirt paths. It was very difficult for the disabled. But the great storm created that opportunity to rebuild Wisley. And a lot of people with lots of ideas inputted into this, and it's a wonderful garden as a result of the great storm, in my opinion.
Today, there's a new look to Battleston Hill. This particular part of the garden has continued its evolution. And elsewhere, there are new collections, new designs, new visions.
Wisley is a horticultural garden, and plants as they are used in the garden, rather than plants as they exist in the wild, is its primary focus. And I can't think of any other garden in this country that has quite such a wide variety of conditions under which plants can be grown.
The RHS, and especially here at Wisley, has this wonderful history of plant introductions from all around the world. And Johnny, when you see these plants, you realise where they're coming from. Hey, that's from Chile. And hey, look at that one. It's a Chinese plant. Hey, I do believe this one's from Japan.
Well, you can imagine 100 years ago, can't you? Intrepid plant hunters spanning deserts, climbing mountains, or, as I've just been doing here, jungle busting in the tropics and bringing back wonderful plants to Wisley and other places. Things like these tropical climbers from South America, or heliconias from Central America, and from further afield and rather earlier, bananas from Southeast Asia. All helping to amass a living collection of plants here. And I suppose most people who come just enjoy the spectacle. But of course, there's a great deal more than that. What we have here is a precious resource, a valuable living museum. Well, here's a perfect example of why it's important to have a living museum. This is a canna. They were very popular in Victorian times, but over the years went out of fashion and out of favour. And if it weren't for places like Wisley, where such plants are preserved, they might have disappeared from cultivation. And now, with milder winters and new trendy garden designers, cannas are right back in fashion again. And that doesn't only apply to ornamentals, with fruit varieties too, where things like apples and pears might have possibly gone out of style or out of fashion. If they're not kept in places where they can be preserved and grown on forever, they're lost forever. The desire to travel the world 100 years ago set the pioneering spirits of horticulture alight. Collectors like Frank Kingdon Ward brought back plants from the far corners of the empire and beyond, making a huge contribution to our plant heritage. Many expeditions have followed, but a century ago it was the Grand European Tour that allowed people to see plants in their natural settings. This Victorian passion for rock plants then inspired one of the first major projects at Wisley.
Growing alpine plants is a challenge, no doubt about that. They are growing in trying and difficult conditions in the mountains, and growing in the warm south of England is difficult indeed. Far too hot in the springtime, far too many long hot days. In the mountains, don't forget, it tends to rain in the afternoon, it tends to be cloudy a lot, and so alpine plants are just not used to the dry, hot southeast of England. The rock garden, to my mind, reflected what you saw in nature. So the rocks are supposed to be not rocks at this stature, but an enormous crags. So you're supposed to half close your eyes, look at a rock garden and imagine that they're actually mountains, and the green mossy plants are actually grass, and the trees are not miniature trees, but full scale.
But even on a small scale, recreating the massive crags and peaks of the Alps in Surrey was a bit of a challenge. There were thousands of tons of Sussex sandstone to move, and in 1911, no modern machinery to make the job any easier.
The difficulty of moving rocks on a sand soil with horse and cart, I can only imagine, but they would have had to use boarding, plenty of planks and timbers to stop the cartwheels themselves from sinking into the soft sand. The transport itself, back in those days, they'd have had steam lorries, I guess, and petrol lorries, but it would have only got to the road and a light railway across from the A3 to here. Absolutely essential to bring in that rock. This is our Larix camphori. It's the oldest plant on the rock garden. It's over 200 years old now. It was gifted to the RHS in 1905, and at that time it was already 100 years old. We have great plans for this area. It's going to be turned into a Japanese-style valley garden with 6 enormous 10-ton rocks and a flight of steps. It should be quite a feature here at Wisley for the future, and that's planned in the next 3 or 4 years.
It's no good collecting plants for reference if you don't know exactly what you've got and where it is in the garden. Today, computers have made detailed records of each plant more readily accessible. The RHS database has over 188,000 entries covering names, origins and details of trials. Kate Hayward has been at Wisley for 20 years. In her office, IT sits alongside leather-bound volumes and fine ink handwriting.
We're very lucky to have records that go back to 1902, and some of the plants which came in then still exist in the garden. The records then were kept in quite a different way than they are today, in beautifully bound ledgers, very often handwritten, and with a lot of information. But it's not always altogether retrievable in the same way as it is today. So they are a mine of information, but not freely giving up their secrets, as it were. This is one of our oldest records, and from here you can see that there's been a very generous gift by Sir Thomas Hanbury, who donated the garden to the Society back in 1903. And here we have a collection of pines, which we'll see still standing in the Pine-Eaton area of the garden today. Here's an entry from Miss Wilmot. Now, she was a great gardening character from the early 20th century, and the story goes that she would carry around pockets of eryngium seed, which she would sprinkle into gardens that she particularly liked. They would come up all over the place, and eventually a name was given to this particular plant as Miss Wilmot's ghost. Here's one of the most amusing entries we've come across, and this is from Reverend Wilkes, who was one of the Society's greatest secretaries, and the gates at the entrance to the garden are commemorated to him. And the seed came in with this quote from the very big man in South Africa, and we often have a smile about that.
Another of the great plant collections in Wisley is under glass. Plants originally brought back from foreign lands need to be kept hot and humid, or cool and dry, to thrive in Britain. A century ago, glass houses were one of the first things to be built at Wisley. Now, in other parts of the garden, there are special houses for such plant groups as orchids, succulents, and for plant trials.
The glass houses which we have now cover around about 4,000 square metres. Behind the scenes, we actually propagate all the plants for the garden and for the trials departments. And that can amount to 120,000 plants a year. So propagation, obviously, is very demanding. And we actually have a team dedicated to propagation that does all the grafting and seed sowing and cuttings, raising those plants for the various departments in the garden. Although we don't have too many plants which actually came back to the glass houses here from Chiswick 100 years ago, we do have two wonderful stag's horns ferns, platyceriums, and they stand either side of the door in the temperate glass house. And they are absolutely fabulous plants, and they are our senior citizens, if you like, of the greenhouses. It's always a joy, actually, to see the visitors coming into the glass houses. You get regular visitors who monitor our progress and let you know how things are going, whether it's good or bad. We get people that have come for the first time, and you get the wow effect. You know, can't believe some of the plants. They recognise a plant growing up into the roof of the glass house, and you hear them say, well, I've got that in a small pot on my windowsill, and then they worry that it's going to escape. Another thing which is always quite interesting is when somebody rings us up and would like to donate a plant to us. Plants are given as gifts, or they grow them on and they keep them for many years. They get very attached to them, but eventually, you know, they're going to push the roof off or grow out of the window or something, and just too big for the household. And they're desperate to find a good home for it. And they think, well, yes, the Royal Horticultural Society, that's the place. And they ring us up, and somebody on the end of the phone says, please, please, we would like to donate a cycad or a cacti, you know, something huge and something very difficult for them to deal with. If it's in good condition and it's something we would like to add to the collection, then we would have it. And that's great. The downside is that they can't forget the plant. And so periodically you either get a phone call or a visit from somebody wanting to come and see the plant that they donated 5 years ago or something. You know where it is, but you wonder why their attachment is still so strong.
Roy Lancashire is a modern-day plantsman with an international reputation. Many of his plants are in the collections here, and this is a garden that can still draw him back.
Long before this was a garden, it was a wild area. It's a very exciting piece of Surrey, and woodland and heath, and it had its own native flora, and it still has. And very exciting flora it is too. So if you walk through Wisley, you'd be walking through a natural piece of England. You'd be seeing native plants. You'd be walking through various countries of the world, because we have wild plants from other countries. And then, of course, you'd be seeing throughout the gardens all these wonderful selections of plants that have been made in gardens and research stations. And those selections and collections are not just about ornamental plants with beautiful flowers or bark or seeds or habits or aspects, but we're talking also of vegetables, of fruits, amazing orchards over there, one of the best collections of old apples in the world. And it's really exciting to actually go through these floral areas into the orchards, the fruit areas. Quite different.
For over 20 years, the fruit collection at Wisley has been cared for by Jim Arbery. He's grown a lot of these trees himself, and his knowledge is encyclopedic.
These collections are a genetic resource of all the different cultivars, where people can look at them. They can be used for fruit naming. They can also obtain material either for amateurs or for professionals, for growing or possibly even for breeding use. So it's important to keep an accurately named collection. We have a great many apples and other fruits sent in to us in the autumn for naming, and that's where having a reference collection is essential. You can't identify them accurately simply by looking at reference books. You need to be able to compare them with specimens taken from a collection such as this.
All fruit crops need to be protected, particularly from birds, and over the years the staff here have come up with some ingenious solutions.
The methods we use for protecting fruits from birds today is mainly with fruit cages and nets, which is the most effective method, particularly on a small scale. But in the past they have tried other methods, and one of the stories I was told was they tried using a hawk, a model hawk that is, suspended over the fruit gardens with a hydrogen balloon. Whether this worked or not, I'm not sure. It provided much entertainment for the people who put it up, and apparently had to be discontinued because of its appearance on radar from the nearby airfield.
As people's gardens have become smaller and amateur gardeners more adventurous, fruit growing has evolved. Today, it's not only about large-scale crops. Fruit trees can now be compact, decorative and easy to manage. A century ago, Wisley started life as a wild Surrey woodland by a river. Tucked away, there's a corner of the garden that's returned to that natural state. On the banks of the River Wey, an oxbow lake has been constructed to form a new kind of habitat, a collection of native plants and wildlife.
Nowadays we realise the importance of wildlife and little wild informal areas, and gardens at home are such an important habitat. These little gardens, whether they be in the centre of the city, can be a great haven for wildlife, insects, a whole host of things, so any little garden can have that great importance. This is a good example. This is an old piece, a dead tree trunk. Years ago, this would have been dug out of the garden and thrown away, but we've left it here, and you can see the holes where woodpeckers have actually been chasing the bugs and the insects which are inside that dead, decaying wood and feeding on them. You know, this would have been taken out. People didn't leave dead wood in gardens, and down here we can do that, and it provides a wonderful habitat for a whole host of creatures. Earlier this morning, when walking down through this area, the kingfisher shot through in that flash of blue. But if we look over into the little island, we can see where the swan's nesting over there. And at the present moment, it's sitting in 2 eggs. So we're looking forward to seeing the young cygnets swimming about with its parents out in the Oxbow Lake and then out onto the River Wey as well.
But 100 years on, the collections at Wisley have become even more significant.
In days gone by, people like Kingdon Ward and George Forrest collected plants in wonderful places like China and brought them back. Today, those governments, under the Biodiversity Conference regulations and under the Convention on Trade in Endangered Species, are no longer allowing such collection to take place. You can go there to take photographs and go on holiday, but you can't bring plants back. So that makes the plant collections we have here so important and so desirable. That is the message that we have to get across. We've got to conserve what we have, because we, in all likelihood, would not be allowed to go and collect in the wild anymore.
This is my absolute favourite part of the garden, the huge double herbaceous borders. Look how beautifully the colours are graded as we go down, and they're deep as well, making room for really huge, bold plants to go in the background. Look at that plume poppy, must be nearly 3 metres tall, and giant monkshood, and then brilliant purple verbenas and pink geraniums. This, of course, is the sort of garden that would have been in fashion 100 years ago as it is now. It's timeless. It's neither in nor out of fashion, really. But, of course, in gardening, fashions change all the time. And in other parts of the garden, there are other classic planting schemes, but there are also some that are so trendy and modern you can hardly believe they exist. It's absolutely fascinating. It was the Victorians who embraced formal planting, the creation of patterns and colour that were seen in the gardens and parks of the time, a horticultural spectacle. That tradition is now reflected in so much on display at Wisley, and still never fails to attract the eye. Well, Penelope, as an international designer, you must have seen some extraordinary changes and trends in the way things have gone. What was it like here at the beginning?
Well, 100 years ago, of course, I wasn't actually here. But,
no, obviously.
I think that Wisley started, really, as a very naturalistic garden. It was full of soft, natural planting of bulbs and rock gardens and that sort of thing. And then, naturally, because it became part of the RHS, it became a great educational establishment. And we have herbaceous borders and Victorian bedding out and all that sort of thing, which is very important as well. But remember, this was the time of the icons of garden design, which was Edwin Lutyens and Gertrude Jekyll, making these extraordinarily structured gardens, lots of stonework, lots of pergolas, lots of arbours, filled with her very prolific luxuriant planting in colour schemes. And this was very much the fashion that went on till the First War. And then everything changed, of course, because people hadn't got labour, couldn't afford lots of gardeners. And this William Robinson idea of making things more natural really came back for the smaller garden then, and in part for the bigger landscapes as well, I think.
And then later on, obviously more austerity and so on, but I thought every garden's supposed to have a lawn, so I think there's one down there. Why don't we go and have a look at it? Well, here we are now, sitting in a small garden with a lawn and with a little fruit section behind and flower beds. And this strikes me as the sort of garden you might have had in the 50s or 60s.
Yeah, I quite agree. I think that's true. And from 1945, I think the history of gardens was being written about the small gardens. It wasn't any longer about the grand gardens and grand trends. It was about how people really lived, real people. And of course, there's the huge garden centres, and you remember we suddenly could grow container-grown plants, whereas before you used to have to buy everything in spring or autumn. You don't remember that? Too young.
I do, giving your order at Chelsea,
yes,
waiting for delivery.
Waiting for 4 months.
OK, and in fact at Wisley here we've got a whole pattern of these small gardens which anybody could set up on their own plot. And there's another one over here that I think is even more sort of up to, well, not that this is up to date, but more modern. Should we go and have a look at that?
I think this is quite a new fashion which will last because it's good for a small garden, it's good for elderly people, it's good for disabled, but above all it's good because you can change everything all the time. Nothing is permanent. You can move the pot that's finished flowering out of sight. You can make very nice groups, colour combinations, heights and so on.
That's very much the fashion now, isn't it? To sort of be almost instant. You buy plants ready done, and then when they go over a bit, you bung them away. You don't even hang on to them.
I think that is true. It's a sort of consumer society, isn't it, really? But the other thing about these container things is you can plant them the year before. You know, you don't have to do them all with annuals. You can be much more economical and put in perennials and lily bulbs and things all in the autumn before, can't you?
You certainly can.
Yeah.
But where do we go from here? What happens next?
Well, I don't know. In the history of garden development, you know, I don't know. The modern garden, it's quite a difficult conception, isn't it?
Well, I'm not sure what the icons like Jekyll and Robinson and Lutyens would have made of this, but to me it's just like a set for Wagner's Flying Dutchman. What's going on here?
Yes, well, it's very what we would call modern, but remember that Jekyll and Lutyens were modern in their day, so it's just a continuation of development using new materials, things that you almost have to be a chemist or an engineer before you're a garden designer.
Yes, it's got cables and steel and so on. Very effective, wonderful lines.
Very beautiful, I think. And of course it was a Chelsea show garden, presumably got a gold medal, and was brought here, and I think that's exciting. And we were talking earlier about small gardens being the trend. And I think the other thing we haven't mentioned at all, really, that the small garden brings into gardening a sort of slightly spiritual idea of refuge. And you go into this sanctuary and it's your own to do what you like, use modern materials, or be very traditional, or like me, feel you've gone all through it and now I only want a flowerless garden, I just want green shapes.
But you have very recently built a rather fine garden here at Wisley, haven't you? And that's modern too.
Well, I would say not really modern. My brief really was from the RHS to do cottage garden planting. So that was in a way going back to Jekyll and Robinson. Very much so, I think. And it was supposed to be that each little bit, although it had to be part of a whole design, but each little bit could have been somebody's small garden. So that was the plan. So I think I would call it pretty traditional. I don't think there's anything modern about it. I would like to be a modern designer, but I think I'm not.
If the Victorians went for patterns in their planting, then today it's colour and texture. One of the most recent developments at Wisley, two vast parallel borders. This is modern thinking on a grand scale. Designer Piet Oudulf has a clear idea of what he's trying to achieve. Swathes of plants that will change through the seasons, bold patterns across both borders, scale and perspective.
I come at Wisley for 30 years already, so I can't say it's an accident that I'm here now. And I love the place for all what it shows concerning plants and trees and craftsmanship. I go more for things that remind you of wild things, or the wilderness, or nature. Or I wouldn't see this happening, what I did here 10 years ago. But so one thing I want to say is that without the staff here at Wisley, I couldn't do this, because they have to trust you in what you do. Nowadays they take on so many good and new things, of which they probably think it is a challenge, but they do it. And I think that's the difference between now and the past. They do things instead of just keep on busy in the traditional way. So I think for me it's the best place to show people what can one do in public spaces, to change the idea of gardening.
That building behind me might look like an Elizabethan mansion, but it's far more modern than that. It was designed less than a century ago. And it's called the laboratory because it is a laboratory. In there, for example, something like 60,000 technical inquiries are dealt with by scientists on behalf of members. There's a good library in there too for students to make use of, and other technical facilities. In fact, this whole institution, as well as being a garden, as well as being a plant collection, is recognised as having horticultural excellence on a worldwide basis. The Royal Horticultural Society always set out to educate and advise. But when the RHS left Chiswick and came to Wisley, the School of Horticulture was dwindling somewhat. It was revived here in 1907. 12 young gentlemen paid the princely sum of 5 guineas to register for lectures and had to provide 2 character references. Moreover, each man had not to be so much below average height as to interfere with his prospects as a gardener. Today, around 2,000 students a year take the RHS Level 2 General Certificate in Horticulture, and now the garden has its own Wisley Diploma in Practical Horticulture, which attracts students from all over the world.
My name's Brian Castro. I'm from Toronto, Ontario, Canada, and I'm here doing the 2-year diploma at Wisley. I didn't hear about it until a year before I come here, and then I was studying in the States. Wisley sort of tacks on as a step up, I suppose, to get more detailed into what I'm hoping to do, which is nursery in the future. So I think it's quite important because it's got such a good collection of cultivated plants, and most places don't have that kind of collection.
My name's Michael Jack. I'm from Edinburgh in Scotland. I'm doing the 2-year Wisley Diploma in Practical Horticulture. I came to Wisley to work in a world-class garden with a wonderful collection of cultivated plants. Student life here is fantastic. We work hard in the gardens and we also play hard too.
My name is Irina Nyamanga. I come from Zimbabwe. The training here is really good. It's really good because we have an opportunity to work along with some professional horticulturists who've been in the industry for a long time, and we are moved around departments, which is good. In RHS qualification, it's well known everywhere. If I could hear of the RHS from the Southern Hemisphere, then it's well known everywhere.
I set out on my horticulture career in the 1950s, and at that time, Wisley really was a very important place to know about. And as young students, we came to the garden to be examined, and the garden was a very different place. It was very tranquil, much less traffic, very many less people, but still the great collection of plants. And it was a great attribute to come to be able to say you've been to Wisley. And of course we were examined by, in those days, seemingly very erudite gentlemen. I seem to remember in trilby hats. It's changed a little bit now, but we were put through the rigours of testing all the aspects of practical horticulture very, very thoroughly. And that still happens today. Slightly different sort of attitude nowadays, of course, because there isn't quite the deference to examiners that there used to be. It's more a one-to-one. But the basic examining is still the same, and very, very important that Wisley should do that and should go on doing it. Wisley has always been full of rich horticultural characters, and there was always rather a sense of discipline about the place, and great respect, of course, for those who were running the show and teaching the crafts. Always Mr. This, not quite so formal nowadays, because that's how society's changed. I remember myself as a young examinee being very nervous about the prospects of these vivas and so on, and we had a senior examiner named Pearl. And Pearl was a distinguished horticulturist, but he wasn't very fond of students and examinees, I suspect. And anyway, we managed to get through and survive, and a number of us went away from Wisley. In those days, the A3 was quite a quiet road up to London. We got on a bus and we travelled out towards London, and the first sign we saw stuck in a field by the side of the road was, "Stake your future with Pearl." Assurance, of course. And we looked at each other and said, "By jingo, we've just done that."
Many who took RHS exams at Wisley went on to become members of staff. George Gilbert was a student in 1948 and later became fruit officer. He remembers taking a visitor to meet Donald Green, the then mycologist, an expert in fungi, in his laboratory.
The visitor was very keen on looking at a postcard that was on Donald Green's lab bench. TBCBH was on the card. TBCBH in red felt. I think red felt tips had just come in use, and the visitor he knew Mr. Green, and been there before, and "Oh, Mr. Green," he said, "sorry to be nosy," he said, "but I'm really curious," he says, "as to what that postcard is lying against your telephone." So Donald Green said, "Oh," he said, "that's to keep us scientists' feet on the ground." So he said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, it stands for too bloody clever by half."
The Wisley trials, growing selected plant groups for comparison, are respected for their independence. Here, the best are awarded the coveted RHS Award of Garden Merit. This garden trials narcissus, delphiniums, irises, sweet peas, and countless others sent in by commercial seed companies, amateurs and professional growers.
Here we are with Rhododendron Yakushimanum Kashirawada. This plant was brought to Wisley in 1946 by Francis Hanger when he became curator of the garden. Now, Francis Hanger used this plant to start hybridising with it, to raise a whole host of hybrids which can be seen growing in gardens today, all with the same compact floriferous nature. And for me, this is what Wisley is all about. From that one plant, we now have over 100 Yakushimanum hybrid rhododendrons which are being trialled here. The judges, you can see them debating on which plant will get that coveted award of garden merit. And of course, trialling has been part of the heritage of Wisley. For 100 years now, we've been trialling fruit, vegetables and flowers. And this is what brings it all to fruition when you see this, a site like this today.
Must have performed very well last year because I see we consider it sparse. It's very sparse. Hold on.
We got an AG.
Yes. You see the same thing in one.
The complete understanding of plants requires records of a very particular kind. There's an extensive library here, but best of all, collections of real plants are pressed and dried and stored in the herbarium. The Wisley Herbarium houses over 70,000 dried samples, and Diana Miller currently looks after this huge collection. Once, a resident artist captured the look of a plant or flower, but since then, things have moved on.
This is a very colourful picture of Canna ensign, which also got an Award of Merit. This was in 1926. But the description in the book here simply says a scarlet plant with dark-coloured foliage, which really isn't much use at all. But we now have another trial, and here's an example, not of Canna ensign, because we didn't have that in our trial this year, but of a yellow one. And we found an even easier way of making our records. We do it straight onto the computer and we add a digital image to go with the specimen.
Mike Grant here from Botany Department at Wisley. Is that Mrs. Phillips? Oh, hello, yes. The plant you sent in for identification appears to be Nicandra phycelodes, sometimes known as the apple of Peru or the shoe fly plant.
A century ago, the then fellows of the RHS would seek guidance and advice from the Society. Today, Wisley receives around 45,000 letters and calls from members and from the public each year.
It may have come into your garden either with bird seed or possibly as long-lived seed in the soil, perhaps from previous gardeners who had grown the plant.
Entomology, the study of insects, has always been an important part of any horticultural service. The first custodian of the reference insect collection at Wisley was George Fox Wilson. The task of analysing and identifying today belongs to Andrew Halstead, but a century ago, collecting was for very different reasons.
In Victorian times, collections were very often of butterflies or moths, and those collections were really for a different purpose. So, largely, I suppose, for decorative purposes, people wanted to get a full set of certain insects. And often, if you look at one of those old collections, there's no data with them, no indication of where they were collected or when. And so a lot of the scientific interest of those insects is lost. But with the modern collections these days, the information is there. So if somebody wants to go back and find out more about the insect, the data is there with the specimen. Most of the things that get sent in there are serious inquiries, and a serious inquiry to the person who sends it at any rate. But over the years you do get some odd things. Somebody had a goldfish or fish which was dying in their pond, and for some reason they thought we could find out why, and they sent one of these fish through the post. And you can imagine what sort of state that was in when it arrived here. It just went straight out the office again, faster than it arrived. Well, we get many more visitors these days, and probably it's a younger age group which are coming. We're getting more young mothers and fathers with children. And that's one of the big differences, particularly at school holiday times. So you can hear the noise of children going past the building, and you know the school holidays have started.
One thing Wisley is really good at is temporary floral displays, and here is an exciting new slant on Victorian-style bedding. A bed of beautiful red cactus dahlias, and they've interplanted them with the South American verbena bonariensis. And anybody who thinks that bedding is not wildlife friendly should have a look at this. It's absolutely full of feasting bees and butterflies, several different species all flying around. Well, of course, besides floral displays, there's a lot else going on here at Wisley of a temporary nature. There are concerts, there are special garden walks in the middle of winter, demonstrations if you want to hone your horticultural skills, and even weeks for children. In fact, whatever time of year you come here, there is always something of interest for a visitor to this fantastic garden.
The RHS exists to further horticultural excellence and impart that knowledge to the public, both amateur and professional. Wisley's predecessor, the garden in Chiswick, was open to fellows only. In 1904, Wisley attracted 6,000 visitors. The public were allowed to enter the garden from 1934, although fellows still had exclusive access on Sundays. In this centenary year, some 680,000 people have passed through the gates. It was Queen Charlotte in 1816 who first patronised the society, and the royal family have been regular visitors ever since.
They had a special spade, you know, I can't remember, there was silver or gold or something, that would be there for the Queen Mum to take up the one shovelful for this tree that was to be planted, you see. And the arrangement was that the then director, one Dr. Fletcher, would do the honours of getting the spade and handing it to the Queen Mum. And like a wraith from nowhere, Francis Hanger, the curator, appeared and grabbed the spade, and before the director could do anything about it, he went forward and handed it to the Queen Mum. That's quite famous, and anybody who was there will always remember it. He did it beautifully.
And it's not just floral displays people come to see. Demonstrations of gardening techniques and equipment are also on offer.
I'm quite sure that a lot of the gardeners here 100 years ago would have been very familiar with this sort of tool. When I started at Wisley, I think we were coming to the end of an era where a lot of work was done by hand. We spent hours hoeing and weeding by hand. The scythe that I've got here isn't the type of scythe that they had at Wisley when I first came here 15 years ago. They were much more the traditional sort of scythe, which is the more familiar sort of S-shape reaping scythe. And they were still using those to cut the alpine meadow and patches of grass like this. This is a Maisto seed sower. What interests me about this little gadget is that the spout actually mimics the shape that you can create in your hand. You actually cup your hand and create that same channel so you can sow seeds like that, which is probably quicker than loading up one of these machines. It's probably why they aren't used anymore.
The society is now much larger, with more than 340,000 members all over the world. The need for steady income has meant making the most of a public garden like Wisley. But of course, there's a balance to be kept.
I can remember last summer I was stopped by one of our youngsters and he said, I'm a member, meaning he was a member, his school was a member. But what was lovely about it, he brought his grandmother. And he was so proud that he was a member of the RHS and that his school was. And he started telling us what his school was doing as a result of being a member of the RHS. So that is a younger generation. It's our future. We can't stay where we are. Gardening evolves. I think you only got to take your own garden. Is your garden the same as it is today as it was, say, 10 years ago? And I think you'll find the answer is no. And that's what's happening to Wisley.
On a summer evening a century on, visitors can come here for more than just horticulture. So, Jim, where does Wisley go from here?
Well, a garden that is standing still, Nigel, is a garden that's in fact going backwards, and Wisley is always going forwards. And one of the big projects that we have in mind is a conservatory, the Crystal Palace of the 21st century.
This is the drawing. Oh, that's enormous.
When you come in here, you'll be able to walk through temperate zones and arid zones. And you can walk through the temperate and then into the tropical. And the beauty of this is you don't actually have to open a door to get from one environment to the next.
Well, that sounds wonderful. Jim, you've had such a long time here and it means so much to you. Just in one sentence, just sum up everything that Wisley means to you.
Well, Wisley to me is a happy team. We can't run Wisley if we didn't have a really good, enthusiastic, knowledgeable team. But it's also about an excitement to our visitors as well. Irrespective of what day you come during the year, irrespective of who you are, you've got to have a buzz, you get an excitement of coming here.
Gardens mean different things to different people. Some come to Wisley for knowledge, others for inspiration, or simply to enjoy the peaceful surroundings. But the future, as ever, is uncertain. Climate change will make us review the way we garden. The need for sustainability and environmental care will be ever more pressing. But if it serves its purpose, Wisley, as flagship garden of the RHS, will be here not only to help gardeners adapt to a changing future, but to provide inspiration and delight for as long as man needs to dig in the ground.
The whole garden is just a joy to be in.
Wisley gives that aura of a good, friendly, warm place, because that's what it is.
And it's great to have been part of it for at least half of the century anyway.